Hello everybody, my name is Dane. I'm the festival director and it's a tasty treat, I'm going to say, to have this event tonight about from food that goes from the lab to the lunch plate and then on into our bellies, or maybe not even our bellies, but some creatures' bellies. I'm going to pass on to the very capable Claire Cockcroft, who will introduce the panel. So Claire is at Somerville College and is the director of the Margaret Thatcher Scholarship Trust. And so she might say a little bit about that, but we'll introduce our brilliant panel to get the conversations going about lab to lunch plate. There you go, Claire.
Thanks very much for the introduction this evening, Dane, and welcome everybody to our, as Dane said, tasty treat, hopefully. Welcome to Lab to Lunch Plate, which we hope is going to give you a tantalising glimpse into the future of food and the psychology of cuisine. We'll also be looking at the planetary impact of what we're putting on our plates and also what we're feeding our pets, as well as the challenges of ensuring that there's enough responsibly made food for the increasing global population without harming the environment. We're delighted this evening to welcome Mark Post, who's Professor of Vascular Pharmacology at Maastricht University, who unveiled the world's first lab-grown burger from cow muscle cells back in 2013. He's pioneering a cleaner, kinder way of making meat in a more ethically and environmentally sound way. Moser Meats, where he's currently Chief Scientific Officer, has just received further funding to scale up production of cultured meat. From an eye-watering initial cost of over $200,000, the costs are now getting more palatable, and we look forward to hearing more from Mark on that. We'll then hear from Ryan Bethencourt, who's a champion of the clean pet food revolution and serial entrepreneur in the US. He'll be scanning the gastronomic horizon for what we and our pets will be eating in the decades ahead, drawing on his experience as an investor in the US food tech sector and co-founder at IndieBio, a biology accelerator and early-stage seed fund. But what's the consumer's view, and what will drive our behavioural changes towards more ethical and environmentally aware methods of making meat? We'll find out more from gastrophysicist Professor Charles Spence, who's the head of Oxford University's Cross-Modal Research Lab and tutor at Somerville, who is an expert in the psychology and science behind how people experience food. Armed with insights from his research at the interface of psychology, neuroscience, technology and fine dining, he'll be sharing his vision for what the future might hold, for example, experiential dining and sonic seasoning. He's also been ingesting insects in the name of science, most recently a bug and beer pairing event. But to what extent will insect-based protein play a part in delivering nutrition to the planet? A recent report by Barclays predicts that the edible bug industry could be worth around $8 billion by 2030, up from around $1 billion last year. But it's not just our diets that we need to rethink. The rising pet ownership globally and trends towards giving them a high content and high quality of meat is compounding the environmental impacts of human dietary choices. According to a study by UCLA, pets are responsible for 25 to 30% of America's carbon footprint. Our final panelist this evening, Andrew Knight, who's Professor of Animal Welfare and Ethics at the University of Winchester, takes a look at the effects of the livestock sector on climate change and biodiversity loss, and also alternative pet foods to reduce the environmental paw print of our four-legged friends. We'll then return to Ryan to fill us in on his latest venture as co-founder and CEO of Wild Earth, where he's been developing a cleaner, healthier pet food that's about to be launched in India following the successes in the USA. We also want to know what your views are on innovations in the food tech sector and what's driving your preferences. So we'll have a few questions popping up on screen throughout the event to take a few opinion polls on what's to your taste. So without further ado, our first poll this evening is about to appear on screen, I hope. And the question is whether or not you follow a plant-based diet. So there we go.
Well, there we go.
Yeah, looks like all the numbers are in. So sometimes 17% as always. Does everybody get to see the poll?
Everyone gets to see it, yeah. So, yeah.
Okay, we shall come back to that later. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker this evening, Mark. So Mark, feeding the world is a complex problem, and the way we produce meat has a huge environmental impact and can't really meet the growing demands of a world population projected to reach 9 billion by 2050. Perhaps you could put in context some of the environmental issues and what the costs are of producing meat, and maybe what your projections are for the lab-grown burger now that you're edging closer to launch.
Right, thanks. Yeah, I guess we know that meat has a big impact on environment meat production. In fact, it's using 70% of all our agricultural land. The whole agriculture uses about 70% of all our fresh water, of which livestock takes actually a big chunk. And I guess Andrew will talk about the influence on biodiversity of keeping livestock. But actually agriculture in general has a great impact on biodiversity. This is particularly pressing because globally, of course not in England and not in Europe and even not in the US, but globally meat consumption is going to increase. In the next 30 years, according to the FAO, meat consumption will be 70% higher than it is right now. That is because partly we go from 7 to 9 or 10 billion people, but mostly because it's a luxury food. It's a state of a status food. And people who cannot afford to eat meat, like in India and China and in Africa, at the point where they become richer and will be able to afford eating meat, they will start doing so. That trend is going on, and that's actually the big driver behind that 70% increase in meat consumption in 2050. And as I said, we are already using 70% of our land to grow the current amount of meat through livestock agriculture. So the math is very easy. We are not going to be able to keep up with that. And kind of nobody really thinks about that as an upcoming disaster. And of course, there are two scenarios. Either, nothing happens and it becomes a scarce product and expensive, probably not too bad a scenario. The worst scenario is that because of the increase in prices that will result from that, people will be incentivized to even grow more livestock. And then we are in trouble, because then we really run into food security issues for the entire population. So it's a pressing need to do something about that. Either we become all vegetarian, which would be fine. You see in the poll, and this obviously is a selection of the population. This is not a general population that is looking at this webinar, but an encouraging 17% of the viewers are vegetarian. Kudos for you. The bad news is that this is not a real reflection of what happens in the rest of the world. And again, meat consumption, if you like, even if we all become vegetarian in the UK or in Europe, it will still not offset the increase in consumption in other areas. So if that, and I think it's an inevitable and clear trend that we're going more and more towards a plant-based diet, but I'm just afraid it will not go fast enough. So that's why we have been developing an alternative, basically a meat product, very similar to what you know, but made outside of the animal. That allows you to have more control over the resources that you put in, over recycling of those resources to a large extent. And obviously it leads to a tremendous reduction in land and a tremendous reduction in water usage. And moreover, some of these animals are obligatory greenhouse gas emitters, like cows, for instance. All ruminants emit methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, and you cannot really avoid that. So if you grow this in a tissue culture like we are doing, you actually don't have that methane gas. So it has potentially a number of advantages. In 2013, we launched that first proof of principle that you can do this. And we also stated that we need to do this. I'm very happy to say that right now we have roughly 60 companies in the world doing exactly the same. Some on pork, some on chicken, some on fish, some on beef, like us. And increasing, these companies are growing, and they are some of them, like ours, are starting to scale up production and starting to approach regulatory officials in the US, in Europe, but also in Asia, to get these products to the market. This will still take a couple of years, I guess. At least in Europe will take a couple of years, because the regulatory approval here takes about 1.5 years at the very least, usually 2.5 years. But given that this large number of companies is working towards this goal, gives me a lot of reassurance that in the coming years you will see the first products, and that we will be able to judge them and eventually decide whether we want to eat them or not. And I'm very much looking forward to that. I'm actually pretty convinced that there will be a big market for these type of products, because we are, or at least a lot of us are still really addicted to meat, and we just cannot afford to continue doing that in the future.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much, Mark. That brings us nicely on to talk to Ryan about your experiences in the US and the companies that you've been dealing with there, and also globally. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your feelings in the sector, Ryan?
Yeah, I'd be happy to kind of follow on from Mark. So, delighted to have Mark on the panel. He is literally the pioneer in this space, in the cell-based space. And so, the opportunity in front of us, I think UBS, Mark, and correct me if I'm wrong, UBS predicted that it's basically about a $45 billion opportunity by 2025. So essentially a market of 0 is going to become a $45 billion market pretty much overnight. And so this is just the beginning of the transformation of the $2 trillion meat and animal protein market. And that's going to be driven by cell-based products. I mean, we've already seen an incredible amount of innovation happening in the plant-based space. In the UK, actually, I'm sure everyone's aware, the supermarkets in the UK, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Asda, are all battling it out to be the leaders in the plant-based space, right? New innovations coming from everywhere, like new types of plant-based products. This is just the beginning of the transformation of our food system to be a more sustainable system overall. And so plant-based is the first step. I think that insect is part of the answer as well, but then we'll be seeing recombinant, and then we'll be seeing cell-based. And I think that's where we're going to see the absolute transformation, in the UK, across Europe, the US, Asia, Latin America, Africa. We've seen the first cell-based meat company actually now in Africa. And so Mzansi Meats. And so, as Mark was saying, I mean, 60 companies, this is just the beginning. This is not the end. This is the start of the transformation of our world and our food system. So, one of the things I love saying is that we're going to see over the next decade, we're going to see more change in our food than we've seen in the last 10,000 years. That's when our ancestors first domesticated, animals and plants. And so these are going to be driven by technologies like cell-based technologies, like recombinant technologies, like plant-based. And these technologies will be version 1, version 2, as we've seen with both Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. But what does version 10 of an Impossible Burger look like, right? That's an interesting question that I'm constantly thinking about. What does version 10 of a Mosa Meats burger look like? Just taking it to the next level, past version 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So food is technology, and we're going to see a revolution in this space. I've been involved with building building and funding over 120 different food and biotech companies across the world. And so, I've been very grateful to be part of the journey, usually the earliest journey. So the 0 to 1 moment of many scientists when they have an idea and actually start executing from that point. And I think that there's an incredible amount of opportunity for people who are present in this moment in time and want to be part of the revolution anywhere you want to engage, right? Whether that's food technology on the plant-based side, new alternative proteins, whether that's fungi, insect, plant-based or recombinant or cell-based, right, which is kind of deeper technology. So I think that's kind of an overview of where we are today. We haven't even seen the beginning of what I'm calling the plant-based unicorn. So we've seen, in Europe, we've seen Oatly become a $2 billion, and I apologize because I'm a little bit biased towards using US dollars versus pounds, although I love the UK. It's just an easier way. Everyone kind of understands 2 billion USDs. And so Oatly became a unicorn overnight, $2 billion company overnight. This is the beginning. Beyond Meat was really the first. It became the most successful IPO in the US in 20 years, beating many .com companies that IPO'd. And so 20 years ago. And so I believe we're going to see multi-billion dollar companies just in the plant-based space. And we will see, as market share is taken away from old technologies, which is old livestock production technologies, we will see increasingly that revenue shift to these new companies like Mosa, companies like Beyond Meat, companies like Oatly, which will become, go from $10 million in revenue, $100 million in revenue, $1 billion in revenue. And then eventually, we're just going to see probably hundreds of multi-billion dollar food companies across that spectrum and continuum.
Great, thanks, Ryan. I think that brings us to our next poll. If you're ready to get that one up, Dane. And the questions are going to be to ascertain what your views are, whether or not you would eat lab-grown meat or fish-based products at home, or any of the insect-based snacks, because Charles has been doing a little bit of research in this area. So Ryan, what's the wildest idea that you've been involved with on the cell-based culture?
Oh, so my favorite is based in North Carolina in Research Triangle Park. It's a company called BioMilk. They grow human mammary cells, human breast cells, make milk for babies, premature babies. Honestly, that is the weirdest and most interesting company that I've come across so far. Is that one, because it's actually a medical product, but it's a food, it's a human food, and it comes from human breast cells.
Fascinating. And we've just got our poll back. So yeah, we have a resounding 67% who would eat lab-grown meat or fish products, a few maybes, and only 7% never.
Yeah, quarter undecided there.
This is interesting, and possibly even, sorry?
Yeah, just a quarter undecided. Maybe they'll try something.
Mm-hmm. But this is interesting on the insect-based snacks. Yes, in a social setting. So perhaps that experience carries people away a little bit more to try things. With almost 20% saying not likely. And I think I might fall into that category at the moment, unless I can be tempted otherwise. And I think Charles is going to tell us a little bit more about this, having been delving into the bug and beer pairing. So Charles, what do you think about these type of products that we've heard from Ryan and Mark, and also how consumers are viewing the prospect of clean meat from your experience as a psychologist, as well as views on insect related protein?
I think the emergence of these alternative foods, protein sources and the like, be it the lab-grown meat or the plant-based, cell-based, the fungi you've heard about, the jellyfish, not so much yet, and of course the insects are all interesting. They're all, to many of us, unfamiliar, and that sort of unfamiliarity tends to be a barrier to trial and then to regular consumption. So we've been interested for a number of these foods about how to nudge consumers to be more daring and to actually enjoy alternate food sources. And we've probably done most of the work around insects, how to get people to eat things like these big-assed flying ants from the Amazon I have here, or some other insect flour, cricket flour, some to cook at home insects, and so on and so forth. And it seems from our research, working with chefs like Ben Reed from Noma in Denmark, and others, that sort of telling people that they should, that eating insects, for example, would be good for them, good for the planet. Neither of those seem to be especially effective ways of transforming our food behavior. and that perhaps instead we should be going more for a sense appeal, trying to figure out what is it that these alternate food sources have, what can they deliver that perhaps traditional foods cannot. And in that regard, we might ask, you know, what is it about insects in particular that put so many people off that they just would not try them? Is it their smell? Seems unlikely because most of them don't smell of anything. Is it what they look like? Is it their texture? Try and find the sort of sensory dislikes, but also likes, amongst which might be the crunchiness of many a fried cricket. Crunchy, crispy, crackly being attributes in snacks and foods that so many of us love. Or it might be when we work with bee brood, that there's a certain kind of lingering mouthfeel and taste that in our work with other food companies, they're always trying to get a longer lasting flavor, but don't know quite how. And some insects, for whatever reason, do seem to have that in spades. So why not play with a long lasting, lingering taste and the crunch? I think that's probably a good way in. Best not to rely on eye appeal or gastro-porn of insects. Probably isn't going to work because the more beautiful ones, the ladybirds and the butterflies, probably are the least, amongst the least tasty. And if we can sort of nudge people away from having insects as a class and nudge the scientists, the psychologists like myself, away from focusing just on the ugly and the horrible ones, like cockroaches and maggots, but instead towards others, we may be in a better chance of sort of nudging people, I think, to take the first step to try these alternate foods, such as the insects, and enjoy them for their sense appeal. And in that regard, we've been, over the last couple of years, working a lot with chefs, but also with psychologists and designers, thinking about curating the sort of early alternate food insect cuisine. And that's been with chefs like Joseph Youssef in London, who has been serving a lot of insects, especially in his Mexico menu. We sort of designed a 9-course meal to take people coming in the door who said, I've never tried insects, I'm really not sure that I do want them. And course by course, gradually they introduce them first as an optional item, so the insect-based butter or regular butter by course number 2, then having some dried insect powder sprinkled over the food, all the way through to the whole crunchy cricket by your dominant hand by course 5 or 6, ending up with, of course, one of those transition foods, the bee products, the honey, pollen, and so on and so forth, that so many of us already do consume and might be the route through, we think. And certainly many people who came out of that experience were sort of saying, yeah, I never thought I'd like them. I never thought, you know, but in fact, I really enjoyed what I ate tonight. It was really tasty. It looked beautiful as presented by the chef, and we hope that will nudge them in the years ahead. And that's going to be paired with work we're doing at sort of food festivals around the science of plating, how to plate insects, how to name insect-based dishes. Is it, you know, alternative protein, flying protein, bee brood? What level of description seems to work with consumers? Thinking about the packaging, and from our work on crunchy crisps always seeming to come in noisy packages, then if you're trying to emphasize the crunch of the cricket, it should surely be in a noisy packet as well, to take some of the insights from other foods into that insect space. And in our latest research just published, we were looking at what sort of situations are they willing to try insects? Is it at home? Is it with their friends, with family, with a romantic partner? And you probably don't need our results to say it's probably not with a romantic partner, but with friends is more likely. And as the survey we just saw picked up on, that people are far more likely to try insects at a pub or at a food festival than they are in a cafe or a bar. So with these bits in place, we think we can kind of curate the experience both on and off the plate, how things are named, presented, and what aspects are emphasized. I think that will work together probably in the future, just with a lot more sort of technology at table, be it through sort of augmented food experiences, through using the ubiquitous technology at table to enhance the experience, be it through adding some musical sweetness, eating from a tablet. And the thing that's really sort of preoccupying us at the moment is really kind of the pandemia related social isolation that is leading to worse food behaviors, and thinking about how digital technology can be positioned to help the kind of the more social aspects of eating whatever it might be that we choose to eat in the years ahead.
Thanks very much, Charles. And for people who want to find out a little bit more, I have Charles's excellent book here on gastrophysics. Heartily recommend that. Lots of food for thought there to think about, which brings us to our next poll that we're going to take. If you've got that ready, Dane. So this is bringing us to the conversation around pets. So we have a few questions there. It's good to see that quite a few people have thought about the environmental impacts of pets. Nutritional soundness, people seem to be happier there. But we'll be coming on to this to find out a little bit more from our resident vet on the panel. So Andrew, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what pets are doing to the planet and your views on the nutritional benefit of plant-based and other alternative products for, I suppose, dogs in particular, but other animals maybe on the horizon where it's slightly more controversial, and we can come back and look at some of these polls as we're going.
Sure. So it's interesting that sadly the top answer to question number one was I don't have a dog, so it does make me wonder if perhaps we should have chosen cats. Look, I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen and bring up, hopefully you can see it there now. This is a very large survey of people who did have dogs and also cats who might be able to add to this. So can you guys see that there? Hopefully you can. Yep, lovely. So this is a study that was just published in 2019 by colleagues in University of Guelph, and this surveyed 3,600 pet owners, so a very large number of pet owners, and it showed that of the vegans, just over a quarter reported that they already fed their pets a plant-based diet, and yet just over 3/4 would do so if one was available that met their criteria. And in fact, of the people who didn't already feed a plant-based diet overall, vegans and non-vegans, just over 35% indicated their interest in doing this, again, if the diet was available that met their criteria. Now, the top thing people were looking for was evidence of nutritional sufficiency, and this has been upheld in other studies as well. People are concerned about the nutritional soundness of alternate diets. At the moment, I'm actually running the biggest study so far that looks at the nutritional soundness of plant-based and other alternate pet foods, and people can actually participate if they like on via the link that you can see on screen. Now, there have been a very large number of individual cases reported of animals on these alternate diets and a small number of population studies. There was an interesting study in 2009 of sprint racing Siberian Huskies. And it's harder to think of any dogs with higher nutritional demands than sprint racing Siberian Huskies pulling sleds through snow, deep snow for long distances for days on ends. Interestingly, the plant-based dogs in this study did just as well as the other dogs. There was a study of a population of cats, around about just over 50 cats maintained on meat-based diets for more than 1 year, compared to the health of over 30 cats maintained on plant-based diets. And again, there was no significant difference in the health of the two populations. The trouble is these are pretty small studies overall. So what I've got is this survey running at the moment. I'll be closing it soon and analysing the results. And I've got around about 3,000 respondents at the moment. And I'm going to give you a little sneak preview of the results because I analysed them yesterday for the first time. So this is the first time I've mentioned them anywhere. Interestingly, the Cats and dogs maintained on conventional meat-based or raw meat-based diets were generally very healthy up to about 55% of the time. The vegan animals were healthy about 65% of the time. The meat-based pets with serious health problems had serious health problems around about 10% of the time, and the vegans did about 6% of the time. There's also a difference in lifespan. There's a big drop in longevity of cats and dogs after the age of about 7 to 8 years of age if they're maintained on meat-based diets, but not if they're maintained on vegan diets. So this is really interesting. Those are the initial results. If you do have a cat, I especially need more cats, or a dog actually maintained on any kind of diet, please do go ahead and participate in this survey if you're interested in adding to these results. Now, it's not just our cats and dogs that are of concern here. There's also obviously concerns about the number of animals that are slaughtered for human activity worldwide. At the moment, we're looking at around about 77 billion land animals being slaughtered each year, and that's about 10 times the human population of the planet currently. There are also around 1 to 3 trillion fish that are killed each year. Now, these land animals, more than 90% of them are intensively farmed, so they're maintained in relatively crowded conditions, in relatively barren environments where they can't exercise most of their natural behaviours. This is very stressful. It's ideal for the outbreaks of disease, and unfortunately, many of those diseases can cross into human populations. We know that the overuse of antibiotics in these farmed animal populations is also contributing to antibiotic resistance. And if we carry on with the current trends, as I think Mark was mentioning, there are actually around about 3 billion consumers in developing nations such as China, India, and other developing nations who are seeking to change their lifestyles to emulate what they see as desirable, affluent Western lifestyles. Those lifestyles involve a much higher consumption of animal products than has traditionally been the case in those societies because animal products have been much more expensive to them. So that's really what's driving this massive increase in the consumption of meat and dairy products that we're expecting by about 2040. And you can see what that does to the figures of farmed animals that are being killed on the slide. It's not just the animals, it's the damage that this is doing to the environment that's of concern. The livestock sector is a very substantial source of CO2 emissions, and this comes primarily from clearing forests to grow feed crops, to feed to feed-lotted cattle, pigs, and poultry. And it also comes from clearing forests to graze livestock themselves, our cows, our sheep, and so on. There are also very significant emissions involved in the produced by the animals themselves, by the cows and the sheep and the goats as they ferment those grass plants in their stomachs and produce a lot of methane. Methane is a big problem. The livestock sector produces 37% of all the human-generated methane. Methane is 72 times more damaging than carbon dioxide is to the environment. So an awful lot of methane is produced. The manure that they produce contributes to around about 65% of all human-generated nitrous oxides. Now, these gases are a whopping 296 times more damaging to the environment than carbon dioxide is. So unfortunately, the livestock sector is producing a lot of very damaging greenhouse gases, which are contributing to the extreme weather events that we're seeing, the degradation of the ecosystems, along with, of course, the clearing of forests to grow feed crops and to graze animals at pasture. And the animal agriculture sector now occupies about 30% of the Earth's land surface. So we're seeing those sorts of impacts as well. There have been a series of studies. This is a recent one looking at the Spanish diet, which is very similar to the diets of other modern westernized nations such as the United Kingdom, and looking at the emissions of carbon dioxide, the water use required, and the land use required to support people living on these sorts of diets. And you can see that there's a steady reduction in all of the environmental impact metrics as people cut out animal products from their diet and transition down towards actually a vegan diet. This is the latest of quite a series of studies which have shown similar effects now. However, nobody's looked at animals, pets, cats and dogs until very recently. But this has just started to be done. There have been about 3 studies published in this area just in the last few years. One of the most important ones was this one by Ocken at the University of California in 2017. And Ocken demonstrated that 25 to 30% of the environmental impacts from the animal agricultural sector in the US are attributable to pet food. When we look at land use, water use, fossil fuels, phosphates, i.e. fertilizers, and pesticides. So there have been some other studies in a similar vein. There's one in 2018 that demonstrated that the environmental impacts of a medium-sized dog actually exceeds the dietary ecological footprint of an average Japanese person, obviously a Japanese study. So we're just starting to wake up essentially to the fact that the environmental impacts are really quite substantial. So what I'll be doing in my research, following on from the research I'm doing this year into pet health and well-being on different diets, next year I want to look at what the impacts would be if we were to transition the world's cats and dogs onto different diets, partially or fully, whether they be things like yeast-based diets, plant-based diets, in vitro meat-based diets, or other kinds of alternate diets. And these are the sorts of things that I'll be exploring: number of additional people who could be fed, food animals whose lives could be spared, differences in all those environmental impacts that we just saw, and of course the greenhouse gases. Now, I think these sorts of considerations are incredibly important for us to be thinking about with respect to our pets, which we've rarely thought about so far in this environmental debate, and perhaps other aspects of our lives as well, because we're literally living through, unfortunately, the 6th mass extinction event since fossil records began more than 500 million years ago. And these are events in which more than 50% of all living species die on the planet. It's happening right now during our own lifetimes. It's very much a result of the choices that we make as consumers, the diets that we live on ourselves and that we choose to maintain our companion animals on. I'll stop there to allow people a chance to ask some questions and make some comments. But thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And maybe we've just got a moment to return to Ryan, who is CEO of Wild Earth, who can tell us a little bit more specifically about what you've been up to in the pet food world, maybe echoing some of the points that Andrew's been talking about.
Yeah, it's a perfect segue. So we really think the future of pet food is actually alternative protein. So we think that, plant-based, yeast-based, cell-based is really the future of where we're going. And so we think that we can dramatically reduce the impact of today's pets and also the pets that are coming in the future. We think that over the next 20 years, we're probably going to see 1 billion more pets on this planet. The growth rates are just absolutely astonishing. A lot of people talk about an increase in number of people. No one's talking about the increase in number of pets. They eat meat twice a day. And it turns out that in India and China, as the middle class is growing, pet population is growing about 20% year on year in both India and China, which is just massive. And so we think that there is this huge opportunity to not just feed all of our pets healthier, but also deal with the huge environmental impact that's about to happen and currently happening today in Europe and the US, and is about to happen across Asia as well, which is going to be incredibly damaging to the environment. And so we've commercially scaled our products. So we've launched across the US. Wild Earth is now probably one of the fastest growing pet food companies in the US. And actually, we actually did launch in India. We launched in India about a month ago. And we are right now with our partner Heads Up for Tails, which is the chewy.com of India. It's one of the large Indian retailers of pet food. We're the #1 best-selling product on Heads Up for Tails in India. And so we're really excited about that. It's still very early days, but we think we have a really significant opportunity to make a very positive impact, not just for the health of the pets themselves, but for our planet as well.
Great, thank you, Ryan. Just been having a quick look in the Q&As that are coming in. one of which has been answered by Mark. Thank you very much for that. We had a question about looking at what the costs were, why they were so high, and Mark's explained that the technology is traditionally a medical technology, and all the ingredients are pharmaceutical grade, so those have gradually been replaced by feed or food grade ingredients, and scaling up and so on. But let's have a look at some of our open questions still, and one for Mark here. How are you solving challenges in creating a steak, such as imposing a larger 3D structure to the cells, co-culture of muscle and fat cells, and a channel and perfusion system?
Mute. The person who asked the questions has listened to my talks, because those are exactly the three things that you need to go from a ground beef product, where you basically rely on making very small tissues, to a large steak. And these are the three things that you need to do: impose a large 3D structure. You typically use a biomaterial and a free-form fabrication method, such as 3D printing or molding or whatever, to create that 3D structure. And you need the biomaterial that is stiff enough that the cells actually follow that biomaterial in that structure. Co-culture of muscle and fat has been done, is actually in some cases better than singular culture, but you need to work out the details in how you do that time-wise, and how you define the medium for the cells to grow on. And the channel and perfusion system, there are many ways of doing that. I spent 25 years of my life making blood vessels, and of course that channel and perfusion system in our body is our blood vessel system and our heart. But actually so you can do this too in these tissues. You can make blood vessels, and you can pump fluids through them. You can also make artificial channels and pump fluids through them. We have very specific thoughts about this as a company, but unfortunately I cannot share them.
Charles, do you want to pick up on anything there about the 3D and the textural aspects that the consumer? Nope. Okay, batting on to the next one. We do have a question for you, Charles. What AR food experiences could there be? Is that altered reality or?
Correct, yes, augmented reality, where one can enhance the actual food experience in various ways. This has been used by some food artists with the ghost truck from about 2016, where they're trying to highlight the fact that various of our sort of staple foods were going to disappear from the planet. I think it was peanuts, cod, chocolate, and something else. And they went around the northeastern USA, giving people kind of tasteless, chewy cubes to eat, while at the same time putting on a little headset that delivered the aroma, synthetic aroma of those foods, to hopefully highlight what might be lost. But in our work, we've been focusing more on augmented virtual reality, so where we can change the appearance, properties of foods. And that seems to be a growing area of interest, both changing what food looks like, given that we eat first with our eyes, giving people sort of new kinds of food experiences around foods that change color, or sort of metallic foods and drinks that might be difficult to produce otherwise. Even making portion sizes look larger in augmented reality than the things that you actually eat, and hence using some of the multisensory science to try and nudge us subtly in that case to eat less. The one case of, I think, of the augmented reality that I'm not convinced will work are those who are trying to digitally stimulate taste and smell, sticking electrodes on your tongue to try and give you a salty taste, or worse still, up your nose to try and deliver virtual aromas. From what I can see, that doesn't work at all in the case of digital smelling, and in the case of digital tasting, the experience is too weak and too thin for too few people to really be way forward. So I'm going with the visual AR, and the auditory, I suppose, the sonic seasoning too.
So just what you were saying about augmenting the amount of food that you perceive is on your plate. Have there been successful studies there in terms of sort of dietary control, and that the brain actually does think that it's getting more and you're satisfied?
Yes, but so far more preliminary studies. So a lot of this tends to be coming out of sort of the human-computer interaction labs rather than nutrition and food sector. And their sort of standards for what counts as evidence, or how many participants you need to convincingly show that an augmented reality cookie that's twice its normal size, they have a much smaller sample size than the rest of us would be happy with. Moreover, we know what happens in a world in which this might work once, or certainly it does appear to work once, to reduce your consumption, increase your society by sort of visually tricking you using AR or VR. But would the brain learn over time that in fact, once those headset goes on, no, I'm not getting what I thought I was getting, and I shouldn't trust the evidence before my senses, and maybe people might adapt. And those kind of long-term studies using the augmented or virtual reality have yet to be done, but are certainly crucially important, I think.
Okay, I have another question here from Kate, who's asking, I don't understand the obsession with trying to emulate meat rather than just providing meat alternatives that don't look or taste like meat. Is this just a marketing strategy? Who'd like to grab that one?
If I may, I don't understand either. So it's my daughter is vegetarian, and fortunately she doesn't really like the meat substitutes, the meat analogs. And I like to cook, so I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to try out a lot of vegetable dishes and pulse and legume dishes. And obviously you find there's a lot of variety, much more than in any animal protein product that you can think of. And, you know, at some point we had a hamburger, my wife bought it, a hamburger that was made of red beets, and it didn't taste like a hamburger, and it didn't taste like red beets. And and it was, that made me start thinking about, well, what is actually the function of these products, right? You can eat red beets, and I love them, but why do you make them in the shape of a hamburger? And I think that has a lot to do with kind of the cultural heritage that you have to have three things on your plate: potatoes, vegetable, and meat. And we basically don't have enough fantasy and imagination to get away from that. But that's, I think, a matter of time. At some point, those very fancy vegetarian and vegan restaurants that have all these wonderful vegetable dishes will teach us that, you know, that three-thing dogma on the plate is a dogma and nothing else.
I might just jump in there with the rise in sort of popular diet culture at the moment of the soup and shake diet, which I'm sure people are very familiar with, where obviously it's liquidized food, you know, so it doesn't necessarily have that kind of, it could taste like meat or it could taste like mushrooms or peas or but we're not necessarily interested in the kind of macro structure of gristle and tender, you know, all that kind of stuff that a piece of steak might have. I think this, the question that Kate has asked there, I think is a really interesting one. And sort of thinking in the context of animals that aren't the purchasers, or even sort of children's food, where children aren't making the purchasing decisions. Is this something we can learn about sort of cross-market kind of marketing and development kind of tactics to think about why do we fetishize about a piece of steak when actually we can get all the protein from beetroots and beans and cabbage and lettuce and all sorts of other things? So maybe Ryan and then Charles, possibly.
So, I mean, I can speak to it just from the consumer perspective. I myself am a consumer of lots of, you know, plant-based meats, right? So plant-based alternatives. I love the taste of meat. I just don't like the idea or the concept of the environmental impact, the factory farmed aspect of it. You know, I live in the US, most of our meat is factory farmed. You know, I don't like how it's made, but I love the flavor and the taste. And so as a consumer, I've looked in the companies that I've helped back and get off the ground. Those are the types of companies that we're going after, people who basically want the similar experience, but without the negative baggage that some might associate with the production of meat itself.
It's sort of interesting also to think, you know, that question of why, what is it about the meat, why does that such a delicious taste? I guess none of us were born with the taste for a steak. Most children might go for the fish fingers or the chicken or something else, that nothing as challenging. So given that we all presumably have to acquire a liking, and a craving for that taste, aroma, flavour, then where did it come from? And if it starts to be the case that Mark's burgers come down in price a bit, and so they no longer become a prestige food, even if you did a perfect imitation, would we find that people no longer wanted that thing with all the fat you have to get rid of or not? And yeah, I wonder why. Probably more thinking is needed about where.
Charles, I just wanted to mention one thing. My wife will not forgive me unless I've actually shared. We also have your book. So Marilis is a huge fan of the work you've been doing. She, on the food science front and perception as well. So anyone that has not read it should definitely read Charles's book. It's amazing.
Could I also just add that the concepts of veggie burgers and veggie sausages and so on is currently actually under threat. The meat industry is actually has got legislation being considered by the European Parliament at the moment. I believe there's a key vote on this next week to actually outlaw the term veggie burger and veggie sausage and veggie steak for anything that doesn't come from traditional, presume Mark would say, more inefficiently produced meat than laboratory grown meat. So that's very interesting. ProVeg is a food awareness organisation. They're one of the organisations leading the campaign currently to try to stop this from occurring. But there's certainly a major culture war going on, I think, at the moment between those who would like to continue the old ways and the innovators who are seeking to bring in these new products certainly I would argue for the benefit of the consumers, the environment and wider society.
Is it vegetable discs and vegetable tubes is the new terminology?
You've obviously watched the marketing videos being put out by the various sides on this issue, yes.
Charles, I think these were actually designed. I think they actually did customer testing to make sure they were the most unappetizing names you can imagine for a food product.
It's the vomit green of the cigarette packaging, is it?
Within the veterinary world, we have a term called dietary indiscretion, which we apply to much more commonly to dogs than to cats. Dogs are well known for eating first and asking questions later, whereas cats tend to be much more fussy. So I suppose whether things like the veggie disc succeed or not would depend whether human consumers are closer to dogs than to cats, one could argue. I'm not sure that's helpful, but there you go.
Andrew, and that is one reason why we started with dogs. Dogs are much easier. We know that with Wild Earth, 90% of dogs, we've tested it, like our food. We know that cats are much pickier, and so as we develop a product for cats, we're going to have to take more time on that front.
And Ryan, I believe your food is sufficiently pure and missing the various contaminants and potentially hazardous ingredients in sort of natural pet foods that it can be consumed by human beings as well. Is that correct?
It can indeed. So if you have not seen it, we have a video out of me eating our dog food to make a point. Because it's like I actually challenge the CEOs of the US's largest dog food companies to eat their own dog food if they really believe it's safe and healthy. Surprisingly, none took me up on it. Actually, one CEO of a small dog food company that sells raw meat did take me up on that, and he looked very sick eating his own. He was eating random bits of animals raw. It did not go down too well.
Well, remind us not to come over to dinner at either of your houses, although potentially, I suppose, Ryan, yours would be the much safer bet, and I'm sure it's delicious.
You'll be fine. No salmonella, no euthanasia drug guaranteed, right? So
and with the dogs, is there any attempt to make these new pet foods look like, smell like meat, or not? Just they'll eat anything that's in the bowl?
That's an excellent question, because we know that for dogs and also cats, the sense of smell is much more important than the sense of vision, which is the opposite for human beings. So, the senses are quite different. It's important when we provide these alternate diets, we not only provide the full set of nutrients that the animals need, but in a formulation which is adequately palatable, so the animals will consume it. So we're looking for an appropriate smell, texture, taste and colour. And certainly the results so far seem to indicate that dogs, certainly the ones with dietary indiscretion, and cats and these pets in general, have no trouble consuming them. Now, some of the older cats that have been maintained on traditional products for long periods of time, with the flavor enhancers that are in those products, can be very difficult to transition off onto an alternate diet. So they can take a lot more time and patience in a gradual transition. This can also be more healthy for the gut bacteria, actually, and their digestive enzymes, a more gradual transition rather than a sudden shock. But certainly with patience and persistence, the most stubborn of old cats have been successfully transitioned onto these diets.
It's kind of fascinating, right? When you think about the old world, I think we, particularly around pets, we tend to think of them as like these carnivores, and dogs come from the order Carnivora, but so do pandas, right? And so they're omnivorous, and I think that's I think that's an area where I think we see a lot of consumers that are actually just very confused. They're like, oh, but my dog's a wolf, it's carnivore, and it's like, actually your dog's an omnivore. They co-evolved with us over Andrew, what's the current thinking? I think it used to be 10,000 years, but now I think
the estimates are 20 to 40,000 years ago that dogs became domesticated versus cats is more like, I think, about 8 to 10,000 years, maybe 15. So they've certainly co-evolved, and their digestive physiology has changed. They've developed the ability to consume much more of human scraps from campfires, these cooked starchy root vegetables that our ancestors were cooking in campfires and tossing out to the more inquisitive wolf dog hybrids that were around at the time, and the friendlier ones that would hang around our campfires and start to eat scraps. So the ones that were able to successfully get nutrition from all those scraps, the diets higher in carbohydrates, were the ones that were successful biologically. They bred, they went into the next generation. So dogs have certainly changed significantly over that period of time to be much more omnivorous.
So we've taken a huge amount of time to get to where sort of animals and people are eating this sort of sophisticated meat-based diet. I'm going to draw this to a close, but before I do that, what I would like to do is, in 5 years' time, what are we all going to be eating? Just each of you, maybe the top 2 things, please. Andrew, what do you think?
I think a lot more alternate diets. I think the COVID pandemic will have focused our attention much more on the risks associated with intensive farming and also the need for health and fitness of people as well. I think there'll be an increasing transition, which is already underway, towards much healthier diets, particularly plant-based diets, because they are the most well-developed at the moment. But we're going to see the new ones come on stream as well.
Certainly kind of wet farms and things. Mark, how about you? What's your prediction for 5 years' time?
Well, 5 years is short. I'm not as optimistic as Andrew, I'm afraid. I think that COVID is kind of a rimple in the pond, and we will quickly revert to our old ways once we get the chance. But I do see a significant trend towards a more plant-based diet, and especially among younger generations, and the poll actually showed it here as well. And I think that is a sustained kind of thing, mostly for ethical reasons, increasingly for environmental reasons. But I think that's an unmistaken trend, and it's that's going to continue, I think.
Okie dokie. Ryan, how about you? Maybe pets and also humans.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to see we will see many more companies like Wild Earth. I'm certain of that. We will see proliferation of plant-based diets. Interesting enough, we're also going to see cell-based, insect-based, just a huge boom of alternative proteins in the pet space. We will definitely see that. I have no doubt about that. It might even get close to majority over the next 5 years. I think we will see that shift. Pets, as long as they eat the food, it's all good, right? Like it's mostly kibble. And so I think that's probably where we're seeing pets. And I do think we'll see cell-based meat in 5 years, although it may not be mainstream just yet.
Yeah, maybe blended or something. Okay, and finally, Charles, what do you think in 5 years' time? What are we going to be eating?
I'd love it to say it was going to be more insects, but I suspect that's not going to be the case. It doesn't seem to be the take up from the food industry, as far as I can tell. So it's just a good sort of test model for what it might be. But I'm in 5 years, I'm very much interested in sort of the leafy greens, really sort of the indoor farming, vertical farming, and the kind of flavour profiles that can deliver the kind of debates that consumers will have to have with their providers about, you know, the lettuce that's never seen a human hand or the broad daylight, and how that's sort of phrased and framed. But I think there's a lot of potential there for leading people into a greener diet through their taste buds.
Wow, I like the idea of that robot rocket. This has been a really interesting and fascinating talk. Thanks so much. Thanks, Claire, for organising it. We've got to wrap up now because we've got another event that's starting in about 25 minutes that's on food and climate change without the hot air. Guys, thanks so much for a really, really fascinating talk. It's really, was made me hungry, actually.